How many of these have you done?
Oh, I don't know. I have to count. But here we're letting people in now. So let's see. Can greet all of our audience members. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris. I'm the events coordinator, and tonight we're hosting the launch for The Woman in the Moonlight by Patricia Morrisroe. She'll be in conversation with Annie Bergen, and you can buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. The link is in the event page, and I posted it in the chat as well. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and Patricia will take your questions at the end of the event. And let me introduce Annie and Patricia now. Annie Bergen hosts a classical music program that can be heard weekdays from 10 a.m. to 3 on WQXR in New York City. Previously, she was an award-winning arts reporter for Bloomberg Radio and Television. Annie has been featured on broadcasts from the Metropolitan Opera, the New York Philharmonic, and the New Jersey Symphony Orchestra. Patricia Morrisroe is the author of Mablethorpe, a biography, Wide Awake, a memoir of insomnia, and 9.5 Narrow, My Life in Shoes. She was a contributing editor at New York Magazine and has written for many other publications, including Vanity Fair, the New York Times, and Vogue. The Woman in the Moonlight is her first novel. And I will hand it over now.
Thanks so much, Chris. And hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening. And Patricia, congratulations on the launch of your book. Let's get right to the Moonlight Sonata, of course, one of Beethoven's most loved works, maybe the most popular classical composition ever written. And we're going to find out more about this fascinating woman that it's dedicated to. But to start off, the Moonlight Sonata was not named that by Beethoven.
No, the Moonlight Sonata came much later. There was a poet and a novelist named Ludwig Rellstabs in a novel Theodore. He compared it to the moonlight shining on a lake. And in the background, you hear a harp, and it's playing sounds of yearning, lonely love. That was it. But then there was a Russian writer who put a boat on the lake. So now we have the boat on the lake, and subsequently people's imagination added lovers in the boat. So it became really something that was incredibly romantic, with lovers on a boat in Lake Lucerne, when that certainly was not Beethoven's intention at all.
But he has dedicated this sonata to this Countess Giulietta,
yes,
for whom he had deep affection for. How did they meet?
I believe that they met, they perhaps met in 1799. Julie, which actually was her real name. She's known as Giulietta because the dedication to the moonlight was done by an Italian publisher. So she's Giulietta, Ludwig is Luigi, but she was plain Julie. And her cousins had come to Vienna to study music and to get a husband. And I believe Julie probably met Beethoven in 1799. However, she didn't become his piano student until 1801.
And then your book takes us through a fictional tale of their relationship.
Yes, when I first started the book, it intrigued me so much that I was very much hoping that it could be a biography, because having had a background in nonfiction, I thought, oh, I could do this. But Julie has always been rather a mystery woman in Beethoven's life. and there was just not enough material on her. So I tried to keep it as accurate as I could based on what I knew about her, which wasn't a huge amount.
Mm-hmm. So set the scene for us. I mean, what was Beethoven's life like when he started to compose the Moonlight Sonata?
He was in really a despairing mood, because in 1798 he started to lose his hearing, and he was having difficulty hearing in higher ranges, and also he was having buzzing and ringing in his ears. And of course, he was then Vienna's foremost piano virtuoso. So he really made his living playing piano. So I think he realized that could possibly end his performing career. And secondly, at the time in Vienna and everywhere, to be someone who was deaf was thought of, I mean, it was a huge social stigma. So he wanted to hide it as much as he could. So he kept it a secret, and really only told a few people. He was trying a lot of remedies for it, but so when he met Julie, he was in a really despairing mood.
Mm-hmm. Was she in fact the immortal beloved?
No, I don't. I mean, that always has fascinated me, why people are so caught up in who is this immortal beloved, based on one particular letter that was found in his desk drawer. But early on, Anton Schindler, who was Beethoven's secretary and his first biographer, said that Julie was the immortal beloved. So she got a lot of, let's say, local press from that at the time, but they looked at the time stamps and everything, and she wasn't. But she played a huge role in his life at the time, because in 1801, he writes to his close friend from Bonn, where he was born, Franz Wegler, that he had met a dear, enchanting girl, and she helped him come out, because he'd been socially isolated. He was feeling much better about himself. He loved her, she loved him. His thoughts turned to marriage, but he realized that she wasn't of his station. So at a certain point, I believe, at least from his perspective, I've not read letters from her, that he was in love with her. Now, Beethoven became easily infatuated with beautiful women, and she was known as La Bella Guicciardi, so she was quite gorgeous. But I believe that there was something very strong between them.
Mm-hmm. What was her background? I mean, tell us a little bit more about her family.
Her family, her mother was a Brunswick, and the Brunswicks, Josephine Brunswick, perhaps number 1 or number 2 candidate as the immortal beloved, was her cousin. They, on her mother's side, they were Hungarian aristocrats who actually were ennobled by quelling a serf rebellion back in like the 1700s. And her father, the Guicciardis, were Italian military family. But again, both aristocratic families.
And so Beethoven was not eligible as a husband?
Oh, yeah, no. He, this was, in many respects, I won't say it was Beethoven's tragedy, because I don't necessarily think that Beethoven would have ever wound up with someone, because not only would it be difficult for someone to put up with him, but I mean, he completely lived for his music. But Beethoven believed that he was an aristocrat by virtue of his talent, and the other aristocrats adored him by virtue of his talent, but they weren't necessarily going to let him marry one of their daughters.
He was dependent on those aristocrats for a living, correct?
Absolutely, completely. I mean, he had 4 or 5 major patrons. The most major one was Prince Lichnowsky, who gave him a stipend, which was incredibly important to him. I mean, he sold his music, the publishing rights, but the stipends were enormously important.
Mm-hmm, okay, and so he did have feelings for her cousin as well, Josephine.
Yes. Now Josephine is there are sometimes when you decide to do a story, it's based on the oddest reasons. And when I started to do research on this, and I knew Josephine was going to have to be a critical part of this, not only was she Julie's cousin, but Beethoven loved them both. She wound up, when her mother took her to Vienna to get music lessons and to find a husband, within like 13 days, she got a husband. He was a formerly disgraced aristocrat. They thought he had money. Big surprise, he didn't. But he owned Vienna's top tourist attraction, which was a wax museum and cabinet of curiosities. And honestly, that sold me, because it was in the bottom of his 88-room palace, and he had there was Mozart's death masks and wax figurines of Marie Antoinette. And it was so weird. And the idea of Josephine living above that, I just thought that was fantastic. But he did very much love Josephine. He gave her the disgraced aristocrat, Count Dame, died, leaving poor Josephine with 3 children and 1 on the way, and being broke, even though she was married off to this much older man, thinking that she would be taken care of. Once he died, she wound up having to run the Cabinet of Curiosities and Wax Museum, and turning the palace into a boarding house. So, that was interesting to me, what happened with these women, and actually how music was used as a bartering tool in order to find a husband.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit, because you really paint a fascinating tale about just the cultural life and just what was expected of women at the time. So talk a little bit more about that.
Aristocratic women, and music eventually started to filter down to the middle class, but at this time it was mainly aristocratic women and men. But for women, they had to learn an instrument, and there were a lot of instruments off limits to them. As a matter of fact, most instruments. You couldn't play the violin because it involved too many slashing, violent movements. So, a man might think, oh, she's got a very fiery temper. You couldn't play the cello because at the time, in order to, you had to squeeze it between your legs. So that was off. The piano was really considered the prime instrument for getting a husband, because a woman could show off her posture, she could show off her delicate wrists, and hopefully her musical talent.
Mm-hmm. So Beethoven dedicates this Moonlight Sonata to Julie. What do you think the significance of that is? I mean, there's a lot of pain in that first movement.
Yes, and I think that's the interesting thing, that people do think that it's, of the amorous lovers in boats. I think a lot of music people hate to read into what composers why they wrote things, but I'm not a musical person. So I can say that in my feeling, I mean, the first movement is a funeral march. I mean, it's in the funeral march mode, and he's mourning and grieving for his lost hearing. You hear that. You hear the sort of repetitive, there's just something so plaintive, and the sense of grief is all pervasive in that movement. I mean, it kind of lulls you into this state, which is, you know, it's beyond words really, and they always talk about it as being a song without words, but that first movement is absolutely Beethoven grieving for something. Was he grieving for Julie? That I don't know, because there was another man in her life, but I would say, from a journalist's point of view, I think it was more about his own hearing. As the person who wrote The Woman in the Moonlight, I'd say it was Julie. But, you know, the piece moves on to this very light, fetching allegretto in the second movement, which just takes you out of that deep grief. And, you know, I always felt there was something kind of cynical about it, as if Beethoven was saying, well, this is the life other people are having, but that's not going to be my life. And then, of course, he moves into that incredibly fiery last movement, which to me is absolutely extraordinary.
What were some of the ways, and getting back to the deafness, that Beethoven communicated with people and compensated for his hearing?
Well, the whole issue of Beethoven's deafness is very interesting to me. Beethoven, you know, when people mention Beethoven, and when I told them I'm doing a book about him, they'll say, oh my God, he was completely stone deaf. That really was not true. The hearing loss was progressive, and he certainly tried numerous remedies. He was not one to sit back and just say, okay, let fate over. Let me give my life over to fate. He tried hot and cold baths. He strapped the bark of the Daphne plant around him, which was toxic, so it caused blisters. I mean, he was always trying new remedies. Later on, he used the hearing horns, and then his conversation books. And what is very interesting to me is that one character who I always loved in the book is Nanette Streicher, who was a woman, mom, like mother of 6 kids, and she made pianos, and we're talking in the early 1800s. So she made at least one of Beethoven's pianos, and her brother created what they called a hearing machine, which was this concave steel contraption, I think it was made of steel, that was placed over Beethoven's piano. So that did help him hear. But he was, even right before he died, in one of his conversation books, he's talking about like smashing up some nuts and putting it in some potion because it could help his hearing. So I think he always was forging ahead and never really gave up there.
Yeah, amazing, just amazing. And of course, there's so many stories of Beethoven being gruff and difficult to be around, just temper tantrums. It's hard to imagine him as this romantic, tender fellow.
Yes, and I think he was incredibly difficult, and I think really he probably would have been medicated today. But yeah, Beethoven had a very difficult personality. and which was exacerbated by the increased deafness. I think his letters are hilarious in that Nanette, this poor lovely Nanette Streicher, as if she didn't have enough to do, she also helped with his household for a while. And, you know, it would be, please get rid of the cook. She's a beast and a troglodyte. Can't you get me someone better? The people are there. The housekeeper is stealing from me. Can't anybody make a simple bread soup? I mean, there was almost constant complaints, but he had tremendous stomach problems. I think when he died, he was diagnosed with, when they did the autopsy, pancreatitis. So he had major, whether it would have been Crohn's disease, I don't know, but he was quite an ill man for a very long time, and let everyone know it. I mean, he didn't hold back on the complaints at all. But it's interesting to me that he really didn't talk about how his deafness impacted composing at all, because I think he was very convinced that that was not going to be an issue. The performing, I think, must have been heartbreaking for him.
Right. So getting back to Julie, she ended up marrying someone else, also a composer, though.
Yes, he's known always as the mediocre composer, Robert von Gallenberg. And who knows? I mean, there's been so little research on any of this. He actually might have been a fabulous composer, but he was a composer of ballet music. And he did one, they married in 1803. In 1804 at the Theater an der Wien, he premiered, I think, his one and only opera, which was called The Little Page or the State Prison. It played for 4 performances. And Julie and Robert von Gallenberg then moved to Naples, where he actually got a job working in a merchant bank until he made connections and was able to compose again. Whether or not that was a love match, I don't know. He turned out, I mean, Josephine winds up, the cousin winds up broke through this matchmaking, and Julie winds up with Robert von Gallenberg, and he winds up not having that much money either. He's got a title but no money, so they moved to Naples.
Amidst all of this, there's a lot of liaison dangereuse going on as well.
Yes, and that's the thing that surprised me a lot, but I think that had so much to do with, if you're sort of pawned off to someone that you don't really love, you're going to have, you know, your liaisons, and they did, and it was perfectly acceptable. It was a little eye-opening to me, although why it should be after writing Robert Mapplethorpe's biography, I don't know, but yes, there were, and as a matter of fact, even in doing research for another piece I'm writing, they talk about Prince Nicholas Esterhazy, who was a main patron, musical patron, and they said, of course, he kept his own brothel in Vienna. It was like, okay, but yes, they lived very decadent, rather debauched lives.
And then there's the aspect of Julie's life that was also surprising, that you discovered she may have been somewhat of a spy.
Yes, this really fascinated me because, you know, as a journalist, you keep on digging and digging and digging, and I found a book that was a French book. My French is not that good, so I found it in translation. That was done in 1927. And then there was a small note about Julie coming to the Congress of Vienna, which was started in 1815 to kind of reapportion Europe after Napoleon's defeat. It was basically a huge party that lasted for 6 months, but it made mention that Julie was a spy for the Maras. And I thought, the Maras, I mean, in my history, I have to say, of that era was not great at the time. And I said, well, who are they? What's that? And it turned out to be Murat, Joachim Murat, the King of Naples, and his wife, Caroline Bonaparte Murat. So I was able to use that to add more texture and color to Julie, because there were spies everywhere. I mean, they were housekeepers, they were going through waste paper baskets, because you had every important figure there descended on Vienna for this, this conference. So that allowed me, because it was, oh gosh, she goes to Naples, and I wanted to be somewhat true to her chronology. So it allowed me for Julie to come back to Naples to come back to Vienna for the Congress, and Beethoven was premiering Wellington's, so that was Wellington's Victory, which was not one of his greatest pieces, but it allowed me to bring them together.
Yeah, Beethoven is the thread running through the whole story.
Yes, yeah. I tried to keep, even though, because there was very little information about Julie, I was pretty strict about keeping to Beethoven's chronology, because how could you not be?
Right, right. We have a question from one of our audience members. What was the biggest challenge for a 21st century woman taking on the voice of a 19th century woman?
That's a very good question. And I will say that at the beginning, when I wrote this, I think I was trying to be more a Jane Austen, and I realized that wasn't working. So I wrote it more in a modern voice, which I think worked a little bit better, at least for me, because you're seeing so many things now, whether it's Hulu's The Great or the new Emma. And I felt comfortable doing that because I felt her story, even though her circumstances were very different, her story was very much a story of today too. And I mean, if you bring in Me Too and the way women are treated and often abused, I think, you know, Julie really was an example of that.
Do we know what Julie thought of the sonata being dedicated to her?
Well, this is very interesting. Julie, as far as we know, only did one interview with a biographer named Otto Jahn, who also did Mozart's biography. He died before the biography was completed, and he handed it over to Thayer, who at the time did the definitive biography. He interviewed Julie. It seems as though it was a really bad interview, because she basically tells him nothing. She said, you know, she thought Beethoven was ugly. He sometimes threw things. And she said that the sonata wasn't really meant for her. She was supposedly given another sonata and wanted to take it back, and he wanted to take it back, and he gave her the Moonlight. But the timing of that doesn't work out, and I don't necessarily think that's true, because I do, number one, think he felt real feelings for her, and secondly, she may have been at that point, you know, who needs the press? You know, she'd already been sort of outed as the immortal beloved, and that didn't turn out. So if you read the transcript, you just know, she was almost, I think she was 68 at the time she died, maybe 4 or 5 years later. He was getting very little out of her. And then he died, those notes were passed on. So that's really all in terms of the record, what we know of Julie.
Where did your research take you? It had to be very intense.
Well, it took me to a lot of books, a huge amount of books, but I did go to Vienna. I mean, and I went to Prague as well, because Vienna, so much had changed because of World War II, whereas in Prague, it remained pretty pristine and very much what it was like. So, you know, I hired a young music student to take me around, and it was fascinating, but a lot of the places where he lived, a lot of places have been torn down. The Kärntner Theater is now the Soccer Hotel. So it was very different, but it was helpful to me. But really the most helpful thing were the books and his letters. To hear his voice and to read the letters, and the letters that he ultimately wrote to Josephine, which they found in after World War II. I think there are 14 or 15 of them. I mean, it's in his rhythm. You can almost hear him conducting the letters. So that's where I found him. And of course in the music. I mean, I listened and I listened and I listened.
I think you said he moved quite a bit.
He moved something like 68 times.
Why?
With his piano. Well, everybody left Vienna for the summer. So you did, and the summer seemed to last forever for them. I mean, they left in May and came back in October, and they usually went to the country, which would have been, you know, Heiligenstadt or Baden, the little towns right outside. So once a year he'd be moving for that, but he never found any place that he wanted views, and that was hard to get. I think because of the piano and playing so loudly, perhaps to compensate for his deafness. He was probably, you know, escorted out of many apartments. He had this habit of dumping cold water over his head in order to kind of, I don't know, wake him up. And, you know, there were instances where the water would drip down into the neighbors' apartments. But he was constantly on the move, constantly on the move.
Do we know what Beethoven thought about the popularity of the Moonlight Sonata?
We do, and he just was, this was not for him. I mean, as he told Carl Czerny, I mean, I'm so sick of hearing about the sonata. Surely I've written better things. I mean, it was a hit from the time it was first published. And the reason is the first movement is well within the reach of talented amateurs.
Interesting.
Yes, they can play the second, but most people who think of the Moonlight think first movement, because the third movement is an absolutely killer movement to play. And I suspect most of the aristocrats during that time, there were some, and actually several women were very important interpreters of Beethoven's work, but I think people loved it. They were fascinated by it. They've never heard anything like that first movement before. And, you know, Beethoven wrote and then he was ready to move on. So I think it annoyed him.
Your book culminates in the composition of the Ninth Symphony and ties once again, Julius into his life. What was the musical scene like in Vienna at that time, and why was it so controversial that Beethoven wanted to perform this symphony?
Well, I think what was interesting in doing this book is that I was able to tie so many things together. Julie's husband, the moderately talented Count Gallenberg, got a job at the Theater San Carlo in Naples as a ballet composer. And at the time, yet another, like the Cabinet of Curiosities, another character named Domenico Barbara, a former coffee house waiter and munitions dealer who did invent the drink we now call cappuccino, and that is true, brought Rossini to the Theater San Carlo. He discovered Rossini. And at some point, Barbara Gallenberg, and presumably Julie, they came back because Barbara hired Gallenberg to help him be co-administrator of the Kärntner Theater. At that point in Vienna, it was Rossini mania. I mean, they just wanted Italian opera. I mean, they lived and died for Italian opera. I mean, they had to do a certain number of German operas a year, but it was really all things Rossini. Rossini stole away Barbara's mistress, the bel canto singer Isabella Colbran. He married her. They were like, they were like the Kardashians of Vienna at the time. So, and Beethoven was somewhat, people respected him, but he'd fallen a bit out of fashion. And then he wanted to be able to do the Ninth Symphony at the Theater an der Wien, and for numerous complications, that didn't work out. And he wound up doing it at the Kärntner Theater, which was perfect for me because I could then place Julie there, and I believe she would have been there.
And that ties it all together. Let me see if I can take another question from one of our audience members. This is certainly a cinematic story. Could Patricia see this book turning into a screenplay?
Could I? Yes. Yes. I saw it in a very visual way as I did it. And I think because it's my first effort at doing a novel and coming out of nonfiction where you're used to doing a lot of dialogue and you're used to doing a lot of scenes, that's the way I wrote it.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how you found this transition to fiction from nonfiction. Was it comfortable? And
it was fairly comfortable, yes, because I think if you're always doing a tremendous amount of research, whether you're doing articles or whether you're doing books, you're researching. So I was comfortable with researching, and because I'd already written a biography before, I could use Beethoven's life in a biographical way and kind of pin the fictional elements to the real story. So I think that was helpful to me. And I was comfortable with the dialogue. And I won't say the story told itself because it took 4.5 years to write, but it wasn't as difficult as I would have thought.
Okay. And do you have a favorite performance of the Moonlight Sonata?
You know, it's interesting. Have been going to a lot of concerts with the American Classical Orchestra, which is a period instrument orchestra in New York, because I really wanted to hear the way the music sounded in that time period. And it sounded very different. And I've just done something with them with an incredible forte pianist from the Netherlands, Patricia Morrisroe. And I would say that is, I will put that up on Facebook and my website, but she has done, I just heard it a couple of days ago, but she's done a miraculous job with it. She's incredibly talented, and to be able to hear it, she plays it on a 17 1995 reproduction of a Walter forte piano, and it's really an extraordinary performance.
Interesting, interesting. So we know that Beethoven had deep affection for Julie, and I guess they found some kind of a locket with a photo or a
oh, this just is one of the really touching stories. Along with, after Beethoven died, they went and his friends looked through his desk, and in a secret compartment, they found the Heiligenstadt Testament, which was the letter he wrote, never sent, where he is despairing. He talks about thinking of taking his life, but his art saved him. There's the famous Immortal Beloved, and there's a portrait miniature that her son, that Julie's son identified as Julie. And it's a really wonderful picture. She's wearing her hair a la Titus, which was the sort of choppy style that had become very popular during that time. She has a red shawl around her. She looks quite beautiful. So in my romantic imagination, I think that he hid it away because he wanted to keep it. And certainly for someone who moved 68 times, he kept it close to him. I mean, he could also have forgotten about it, but I rather doubt it, given the other things that the Immortal Beloved letter was there, along with the Heiligenstadt Testament, that these were important things for him.
What about, just going back to Beethoven and his life, what about his childhood? Were there aspects of that you think really impacted him as an adult?
I think hugely. I think the firstborn child was also named Ludwig, and he died. The father was an alcoholic who was very invested in his career, and would wake him up in the middle of the night to have him play piano. A very, very harsh upbringing. A lot of these composers seem to have fathers who were, very difficult and very invested. So, and he was always an outsider. He really was, no matter whether it was in Bonn or ultimately in Vienna. He had very dark skin, and they called him the Spaniard in Bonn. And because of his very gruff manners, and because he, said whatever popped into his mind, people were a little afraid of him as well. Mm-hmm. But I think there's one thing I wanted to mention. It's interesting because there's a man named Theodor Albrecht who is now translating the Beethoven's conversation books. And the conversation books were kept after about 1819, when Beethoven was really having difficulty hearing. And people would write down their questions in the conversation books. And Theodor Albrecht, in translating the books, is finding that Beethoven had hearing far longer than we thought. Mm-hmm. That he maintains from analyzing the conversation books that he could hear something at the Ninth Symphony, and probably was hearing something a year before he died. There's one entry in which he talks about, he advises someone not to use the ear horns. He said, by not using anything like that, I was able to keep some hearing in my left ear. So I think this will be very interesting when those conversation books are finally translated into English, because it will put a whole, yes, he was deaf, but it wasn't that he could not hear. He could hear something, which is not to take anything away from him, but it just colors it in a different way.
Right. And what do scholars believe was the cause of the deafness, or do they not know?
I don't think they really know. I think people talked about that he had lead poisoning. That was, cirrhosis, lead poisoning in terms of his death. At the time, there was a tremendous amount of lead used in wine goblets, plates. So that seems to be the one thing that people throw out the most. On the other hand, a lot of other people were using lead goblets and lead plates and didn't lose their hearing. So I don't know. He had so many physical ailments. He really did. And no one really knows for sure.
All right, we're going to take some questions from, I can open this. Let's see. When writing descriptions of Beethoven's composing and concerts, did you play Beethoven?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I luckily did not, since Julie, I listened to a lot of Beethoven, but I mostly honed in on the pieces that she would have heard, and she would have played. So there was the Ninth, there was the Seventh, Eighth Symphonies. I listened to it, the Grosse Fuge. I loved the fact that Julie, and I don't know if this was the case, but I wanted to have Julie be there to listen to the Grosse Fuge and, with her daughter, because what in the world did people think in that time of that incredibly advanced piece? So the pieces that I wrote about, I listened to a lot.
Okay. We sort of touched on this already. After a long, successful career as a writer of nonfiction, did you find writing the novel harder or easier?
Different. I wrote 2 memoirs, and you don't have to do a lot of research when it's about yourself. The one about Wide Awake, a memoir of insomnia, I did do a lot of sleep research. That was just a lot of fun for me to do, although I had to get up to speed on science, which I got a D in 8th grade. But it was different. I would say harder. I would say harder than the memoirs, not as hard as doing Robert Mapplethorpe's biography. Nothing was ever as hard as that.
Oh. And what particularly inspired you to write this story? What was it about Giulietta that you said, I have to do this?
Well, it was, I will give credit to a friend who was also an editor who threw this idea out to me at lunch and said, Beethoven was in love with a young piano student and he thought it would make the basis of an interesting novel. He didn't actually even know her name, but I started to do the research, and also I came out of a musical background. I took piano lessons for 12 years. I took voice lessons, and once I started writing, for some strange reason, I stopped doing all of that. I think it's very difficult to be sitting at a keyboard all day and then go to a keyboard. You sort of want to get away from a keyboard. And then I think as a writer, you're always trying to develop your voice. And in developing my voice, I think I felt I didn't need the other voice, which is sort of crazy, but I left that behind. And really, once this editor mentioned Beethoven, I realized it was a way for me to get back to the music and my background that had meant a tremendous amount to me. So again, this story and everything else is sort of pulling things full circle, and this book did that for me. I would always go to the symphony and the opera, but not as much. I was much more a theater person, and this opened up that world for me again, which I'm very grateful that it happened.
Would you write something else about Beethoven?
Well, I am. I just finished a piece that I think is going to be in the Times next week this week, about George Polgreen, Bridge Tower, who was the original person Beethoven dedicated Kreutzer Sonata to. Maybe I can just, make my career out of writing about people he dedicated sonatas to and then took them back. He took Bridge Tower, they got into a fight over a woman, and I'm pretty sure it was Julie, because they were going to dinner at her house around the same time. But that's what I have been writing, just finished, for the past couple of weeks. He's a fascinating story, a brilliant violinist whose tale got lost to history. No thanks to thanks to Beethoven.
Okay. Again, more about switching from nonfiction to fiction. What was the most fun?
The dialogue. The dialogue and having things happen that I did not, I had an outline of Beethoven's life, which I stuck to very much, but I didn't with Julie. And because I'd never written a novel before, I never wrote an outline of the novel. So I would sit down, and I had a lot of stuff in my head, but I was amazed at what would happen, how people would come into a room and something would happen, and I would say, oh, I didn't think that was going to happen, but it works. And then I would go back and see that I had already laid the groundwork for it, but I hadn't realized it. So it did open up a creative side that was much more meaningful to me than the other work I'd done.
Okay. How do you handle stumbling blocks that you might encounter during your process?
Oh, you just sit down. I once did an interview with the really wonderful poet Amy Clampett, and she said every morning she just sat down and she wrote, and she sat there, at 9 o'clock and then got up at 5 or something. I treated it as my day job. I just go, I worked every day. So, one expects stumbling blocks, but you would just power through it. And at this point I've been writing long enough so that that there are going to be stumbling blocks, and you do know or hope that you can get over them. But it really is, to me, the discipline of just sitting down and knowing this is what you're doing day in and day out.
Do you write at a particular time of day or for so many hours?
I write pretty regularly. I won't say 9 to 5, but it's a full day. Say 9:30 to 5. I'm very regimented. And then 1 o'clock, I used to go out. I'm not in the city right now, but I would go out to get my latte. So no, I've always kept a very strict regimen. I went to Catholic school. What can I say?
Can you elaborate on Julie being a spy? Who was she a spy for?
Well, she was a spy for the king and queen of Naples. And the king was Joachim Murat, who was Napoleon's brother-in-law, one of the most valiant of his cavalry officers, who was married to Napoleon's youngest sister. And at the time, Murat is an incredible character, and anyone who's been to the Louvre, they will see huge portraits of him. He was called the Dandy King. He had, the people, his valet, come in and finger curl his hair every morning. He designed his own costumes, and his Caroline was a brilliant politician, and I think she thought her husband was a bit of a dunce politically, although she admired his valor on the battlefield. But Naples, they wanted to make sure that he would keep his kingdom when they were dividing up Europe. So they were what they called society spies. Gallenberg's sister was married to an imperial chamberlain, so Julie would have had sort of great access because of her sister-in-law. So I think that's what happened there. And then, of course, sadly, or not, depending on whose side you were on, Murat did lose his kingdom and his life. He was killed by a firing squad, refused to wear a blindfold, and was kissing a locket of his wife.
A lot of political intrigue
a lot
going on.
A lot. Well, it was during the Napoleonic Wars, so as I was researching, it was all right. Okay, there's Beethoven, not exactly a minor figure in music. So I'm trying to get up to speed on Beethoven. And then it's like, oh no, do you have to throw in Napoleon at the same time? So I sort of had to track him as well, but not as closely.
Right. Okay, someone asks, if Beethoven were to live above a cabinet of curiosities himself, after all your amazing research, what would you expect to be in it?
Oh, I think Beethoven probably would have expected, and he says this to Julie when he looks at Mozart's Death Mask, he says, one day I'll be that. I think it would have been, it would have been a wax figure of Beethoven, and it probably would have been his death mask, because they were big on death masks at that point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the parts of the book about the piano duels was very interesting, and the way in which the aristocrats would fawn on the popular composers like they were rock stars. Were the duels a real thing, and how popular were composers like Beethoven with the common folk?
Duels were a huge thing. Really, they were the equivalent of gladiatorial combat. I mean, people had their sides, they were clapping. I mean, it was like a musical blood sport. And Beethoven, because he was such a phenomenal player, took on all the heavy hitters who'd, come through Vienna, and he would be expected to play. In terms of his popularity with the middle class, that's a very good question, and I am not sure. I think for the most part, he talked about all he wanted was, a pretty face to sigh at his music. And I think a lot of the issue was that he mostly surrounded himself with aristocrats, so never met, the women would never wind up with him because they were too far above him in station. But I do know that the tickets for the concerts, they were for on a scaled basis, so people could have standing room. But in terms of my research, I don't know, I didn't read about anybody, coming from the middle classes who wrote about his music, because they wouldn't have.
What do you think, what are the lessons that Beethoven has to teach us today?
Oh, I think so many. I think, first of all, the Moonlight begins with a funeral march, but ends in this fiery resurrection. I mean, if you listen to that third movement, you know that this is somebody who's going to rise above every issue that is put in front of him, and he does. So there's that, and then of course there's the Ninth Symphony and the Ode to Joy, and how he's using the Schiller poem and talking about the brotherhood of mankind and how we should aspire to the canopy beyond the stars. There's something so deeply spiritual and also, you know, hey guys, we're all in this together. And if we unite, we can make the world a better place. And I do believe he believed that. And he went through some very tough times personally and politically.
Mm. We have a couple more questions. I'm not sure how much longer, but I'll keep going until, what was your biggest revelation about Beethoven? Something you weren't expecting about his character or personality?
The tenderness. The tenderness. If you listen to some of the pieces, the later sonatas, or the cavatina from the late string quartets, it breaks your heart, because you always think of Beethoven as, you know, Sturm und Drang and, you know, Eroica and the power symphonies. But for me, it was these small little moments that were just so tender and so unexpected. Mm-hmm. And that helped me a lot in conceiving the character of him.
If you were to write another novel, what other period of history intrigues you?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think now intrigues me a tremendous amount. Now, but a lot of people are going to be writing about now. I honestly don't know. I mean, I was in the 19th century for so long. It's been very strange to be pulled out of it. And as I've always said to people, my friends, you know, I was isolated in the 19th century, and now I'm isolated in the 21st century. I mean, this was a wrong time to come out of the 19th century, but then again, I could have had consumption or any other disease. And at this age, I would have been dead 30 years earlier, so.
Which of your characters did you love best in the end?
Julie.
Julie.
She was my narrator. Mm-hmm. And I loved her because, like Beethoven, she didn't give up. She kept on moving ahead. She never let, you know, yes, we have moments of depression, but she was in an incredibly oppressive patriarchal society, and she dealt with the blows that came her way. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, she really triumphed.
She really was the nurturing force, as you portray her in the book, like through Beethoven's life, just there for him, these pivotal times. And
yes, and I wanted that for him. Yeah. I did. I wanted a Julie for him. He didn't have it in real life, although, you know, one doesn't know for sure, but I wanted to give it to him.
Right. Okay, that's pretty much all the questions that we have from those who are here in the room with us. And I want to thank everybody for coming, and thank you, Patricia.
Oh, thank you so much for doing this.
Awesome. Thank you. This was great. Thank you to Annie and Patricia, and thank you to everybody who asked questions. A lot of really good questions. If anyone missed any of the event for any reason, we'll be on YouTube soon. And please buy the book if you haven't already. Through the link on the event page, every book helps us put on more great free events. We have the launch for Alex Ross's Wagnerism on the 14th, which is our next classical related launch, which will also be great. Thank you so much for coming, and good night.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.